Hello everyone. We're going to make another imaginary journey to the past tonight and follow the history of ancient Persia, from the beginnings of civilization in Iran thousands and thousands of years ago to the 7th century AD, when the last antique Persian Empire fell. In the Western tradition that we inherited from the Greeks and the Romans, the various kingdoms and empires that flourished in Persia were often seen as antagonists, as threats coming from the east that even came close to dominate Greece, and later that threatened the Roman Empire. But there is so much more to ancient Persia. It was a beacon of civilization for centuries, with a cultural area that spreads far beyond the modern frontiers of Iran. Persia had a very tumultuous history. It was invaded multiple times. It received influences from India, from Central Asia, from the whole Middle East and Western civilizations. But the invaders that Persia couldn't push back militarily, it converted culturally. And a constant feature of Persia all along its history is that it always reappears, revives as an independent state before the Muslim Conquest, as we're going to see tonight, or after. If you are interested, we could continue the story another time to explore the last 14 centuries to our days, which are no less fascinating. We will also talk about aspects of ancient Persian culture, including its religions like Zoroastrianism, its architecture. We will travel to Persepolis at the time of its splendor. We will relive the Greco-Persian Wars and many more things. So we have plenty of things to discover, but all you need to do now is adopt a comfortable position, relax, and let the sound of my voice guide you along the centuries. You can easily navigate the story with the timestamps in the first comment, and it will soon be available on Spotify, Apple Music or Amazon Music, if this is more convenient for you, together with dozens more of my stories. And as usual, you will find a link to my Patreon in the first comment. If you choose to support the channel on Patreon, you contribute to keep it free of video ads, and you can download audios and videos, listen to the stories as podcasts, participate in surveys, and get more updates about what I'm working on. But for now, take a single deep breath, sit or lay down comfortably, and feel free to close your eyes at any time. You don't need the visuals to follow along. Our story begins right now. The first and probably the most famous Persian Empire is the Achaemenid Empire that existed in the first millennium BC, from the 7th to the 4th century. It is the one that Alexander the Great destroyed and conquered entirely. The heartland of this empire was a region of the southwest of modern Iran, the region of Persis, where an ethnic group, the Persians, dominated. But when this first empire started, The ancient Persians were almost newcomers to the region. They had arrived 300 years before to a land that already had thousands of years of urban culture and had been influenced by other civilizations of Mesopotamia, Sumer, Assyria, Babylon. What became Persia is home to some of the most ancient remains of settlements, of agricultural communities in the world. The earliest ones are 10,000 years old. The southwestern part of modern Iran is part of the Fertile Crescent, which is a large region in the Middle East that stretches from Egypt to Mesopotamia, where many of humanity's first major crops were domesticated, and where the first large towns and cities appeared, followed by states during the Bronze Age, 5 to 6,000 years ago. Maybe with the influence of Mesopotamia, many prehistoric settlements were created to the east of the Fertile Crescent, on the Iranian Plateau. If we take a look at the geography of Persia, its heartland and central historical region is an elevated plateau surrounded by mountain chains. It is not perfectly flat. It contains several mountain ranges and the altitude varies a lot, but overall it raises higher than the plains that surround it in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and in India. Geography is an element that can shape culture, and it definitely did in the case of Persia. The plateau is semi-arid. There are rivers that cross it, and some parts are fertile, but overall it is an environment where water was not as abundant as it was around the large rivers of Mesopotamia or the northwest of India or Egypt. Much later, Persia became famous for its gardens. In this environment where irrigation was mandatory, they were a sign of refinement and luxury. The Iranian plateau was not the easiest environment for large cities to appear, and indeed, long before the Achaemenid Empire, the most advanced culture technically and administratively, and the first states that we know of in this part of the world, emerged at the foot of the plateau, in coastal plains that are connected to Mesopotamia. This first civilization in Persia is called Elam, and it consisted of different kingdoms along the coast of the Persian Gulf that progressively expanded to the Iranian plateau. Eventually they may have been unified under a single state, with its capital in the city of Susa. They had a writing system, but a lot of what they wrote was lost and disappeared. Elam had a proximity to other Mesopotamian cultures, but there were enough differences to consider it an independent civilization. It had its own language and a specific religion, probably influenced by its neighbors, but their deities were mostly forgotten, and little is known about their pantheon and their belief system. Elam lasted for almost 3,000 years, and was the predecessor of the Achaemenid Empire. It had a strong cultural influence on it. For example, the Elamite language remained an official language in the Persian Empire. So, since the beginning, I have used the terms Persia and Iran almost as synonyms, and up to a point they are, but not entirely. What are the differences between these two terms? Until the 1930s, the country was called Persia internationally, until it decided to change its official name to Iran, and this was adopted everywhere. So Persia became a historical term. It is no longer used politically. But the word Iran is way older than this. It corresponds to a group of peoples, the Iranians. The country became known as Persia in the West mainly because of the Greeks. They were threatened by the Achaemenid Empire. Later they conquered it, and they named it Persia after the province of Persis, or Pars. They also named its capital Persepolis. Polis means city. But this central province of the Achaemenid Empire was only a small part of the empire itself. And later the various states known as Persia along history were not limited to it. So the name has a local origin that can still be found in the modern province of Pars or Fars in modern Iran, or in Farsi, the Persian language. Now, Iran is also a very ancient term, but it refers to the Iranian or Iranic peoples, who were a branch of these Indo-European peoples I told you about in many stories lately, about the Greeks, the Romans, the Celts, the Germans, the Slavs. Indo-European peoples emigrated from a region that is believed to be north of the Caucasus, and it started several thousand years ago, slowly and in several waves. They reached almost every region of Europe, where they mixed with the locals. We don't know in which proportions or exactly how things unfolded, because there are no written records of all this, of course, and it is mainly through languages or cultural features or more recently DNA that aspects of this migration have become better understood. Apart from their numbers, which are uncertain, what we know is that in many regions these Indo-Europeans had a strong cultural influence. Their languages prevailed, even though they evolved and diversified a lot due to the distances and local influences. With the exception of a few European countries, like Hungary or Finland, where the dominant language is not of Indo-European origin, all other European languages evolved from Indo-European roots. It doesn't mean we could understand these dead languages at all, but some of the words under different forms, some of the sounds, or the structure of speech have remained. Now, all Indo-Europeans did not migrate westward. Some went to the southeast, towards the Caucasus, Iran, and the northwest of India. Hence the term Indo-European. And in these lands they also brought a new culture and language that left a strong footprint, even after centuries and centuries of mixing with earlier inhabitants. So the Iranian peoples were part of the migration. They are a branch of it. In the 3rd millennium BC, Indo-Europeans settled into Central Asia, and from there, several distinct ancient Iranian peoples emerged in the 1st millennium, stretching from Eastern Europe to West Asia. Antique peoples like the Alans, the Bactrians, the Scythians, and more importantly for us, on the Iranian Plateau, the Medes, the Parthians, and the Persians. This is how the Persians arrived in Iran around 1000 BC, 3000 years ago, and like for many other Indo-European peoples, they assimilated, and for a part were assimilated, bringing a strong cultural change to the region where they had settled. The area occupied by Iranian peoples then shrunk in the first millennium AD because of other migration waves, the Slavs, the Germans, the Turks, and much later the Mongols. They were expelled or assimilated within these populations. But they still cover a large area that stretches from the Caucasus in the north to the Persian Gulf and east-west from eastern Turkey to China. They are not alone in these lands, but they dominate demographically. All this history is behind the change in name of the country from Persia to Iran. Persia was a historical term chosen by the Greeks that referred to either a small region or to ancient empires with moving frontiers, so the term Persia may be culturally accurate, but geographically it is very imprecise. And also in the 1920s and 1930s, when the change of name was decided, the term Persia was identified with a form of decline. For decades the country had shrunk and lost some of its prestige. In 1921, a general, Reza Pahlavi, took power and was proclaimed Shah, King of Persia, beginning a new dynasty that lasted until the Iranian Revolution of 1979. His priorities were to modernize Persia and reassert its independence, which was under threat by the influence of foreign powers, especially Russia and Great Britain. The change in name was a way of showing that a new start, a fresh beginning, was happening, and also to symbolically refound the country on a more ethnic basis, which distinguished it well from its Turkish or Arab neighbors. It is a fact that the country has a strong and distinct identity from the rest of the Middle East, a different language, different ethnicities. It has become the champion of Shia Islam. There were religious reasons to it, but in no small part this reflects its particularism. And this is how Persia became Iran 90 years ago. But both terms are extremely ancient, they are more than 2000 years old. Now let's return to ancient history. I told you that Iranian people settled around the 10th century BC on the Iranian Plateau, and doing so they forced the Elamites to relinquish one area of their land after another. Three main peoples that we will speak more about occupied the plateau: the Medes, the Persians, and the Parthians, all three different Iranian groups. Elam was not really a threat to their independence, but Assyria was. At the time, the rising power in the Middle East was the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It is called Neo because the region of Assyria, in the north of Mesopotamia, had already expanded before. But starting in the 10th century BC, Assyria conquered large parts of the Middle East, mainly to the west, as far as Egypt, and to the north. The Iranian Plateau was on its eastern frontier, and the peoples that populated it fell under its influence. They had to pay tribute to Assyria and obey its orders. The power of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was based on a large population, effective military tactics, and a technological edge. They were the first in history to be armed with iron weapons that were far superior to bronze weapons. They were lighter and stronger. At its peak, Neo-Assyria had conquered all its rivals, Babylonia, Elam, Phoenicia, Israel and Judah, and the other great power of the Middle East, Egypt. It became probably the most powerful state in the world at the time, and it developed an administration and ways of controlling a multinational empire that later inspired the Persians. But after 300 glorious years, Assyria began to disintegrate after the death of its ruler, King Ashurbanipal. This happened in the 7th century BC. A civil war began, and multiple peoples, including the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, raised against Assyria. At the end of the 7th century, Assyria was no more as an independent state, and the Iranian Plateau had recovered its independence. But these decades of Assyrian domination, and then the war against Assyria, had transformed it. When they had settled in the region, the Medes or the Persians had a nomadic lifestyle based on breeding. Their small kingdom on the plateau had received Assyria's influence, and they had turned into larger and more centralized states with a sedentary population that could now raise armies and taxes in cities that had become bigger. The one kingdom that emerged as a leading power was that of the Medes. They expanded into Mesopotamia, and they founded the first Iranian Empire. But this empire of the Medes was short-lived, because it was replaced with the Achaemenids. The epic of the Achaemenid Empire was about to begin. The Achaemenids are a dynasty, and the empire was named after them, like for the Ottomans, for example. And they were not Medes but Persians. Like the Medes, the Persians had evolved since their arrival on the plateau around 1000 BC. They had changed from groups of nomads to a sedentary kingdom that had repelled or conquered the Elamites, and they had even installed their capital in the previously Elamite city of Anshan. The ancestor of this dynasty was called Achaemenids, hence the name of the family, but it is unknown with certainty whether he was real or mythological, because there are no records of his life or his actions. The name of Achaemenids and his successors are transliterations of Persian words into Greek, This is how we know them, and these are the names I will use. But obviously they called themselves in the ancient Persian language. Achaemenids would have lived around 700 BC, but his dynasty really became important 4 or 5 generations later, with King Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great, who created this empire. This genealogy is known mainly from the Cyrus cylinder, an ancient clay cylinder with inscriptions that was discovered in the ruins of Babylon and dates from the 6th century BC. It is contemporary to the foundation of the Achaemenid Empire, but the accuracy of its content cannot be cross-checked with other documents. When Cyrus II inherited the kingdom, the Medes were the dominant power of the Iranian Plateau. But he revolted against them, captured the capital and the king, and proclaimed himself his successor. In fact, he absorbed a much bigger state than his own, and when he replaced the Median state with his own, he also inherited conflicts with the 2 main kingdoms at its frontiers, Lydia in what is now the west of Turkey, and Babylon, which had freed itself from Assyrian domination and had begun an expansion of its own, known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Cyrus the Great was one of the greatest conquerors of the antiquity. In the following years, he conquered and annexed his 2 main rivals, starting with Lydia. The last king of Lydia, who was defeated by Cyrus, was called Croesus. Little is known about him, but a legend appeared, started by Greek historians, about his supposedly fabulous wealth, hence the phrase rich as Croesus. Maybe the ancient Greeks were impressed with the size of Lydia, which was their neighbor on the other side of the Aegean Sea. In any case, Lydia was much larger than any Greek kingdom or city-state in the 6th century. But there is no solid proof that he was particularly wealthy or powerful. He was vanquished anyway in 546 BC, and the Achaemenid Empire annexed all of Anatolia. A few years later, in 540 BC, Cyrus crushed Babylon and put an end to its influence, annexing a large part of the Babylonian Empire. This is why Cyrus is praised in the Hebrew Bible for his actions in the conquest of Babylon. By taking the city, he freed the captives from the kingdom of Judah, who could return to their land, and later he authorized the reconstruction of Jerusalem, including the Second Temple. I told you about this in a recent story about the Ark of the Covenant. We will come back to the cultural and religious policies of the Achaemenid Empire in a moment, because in fact it administrated very different peoples with a variety of cultures, languages and religions, and did it with quite a lot of toleration and autonomy in that regard given to its provinces. Cyrus lived for conquest, and after Babylon he turned to the east, expanding into Central Asia. He died on one of these expeditions in 530 BC, having conquered in 20 years the largest empire the world had ever seen. He was succeeded by his son Cambyses II, who continued conquests and added Egypt to the empire. The days when Egypt was a Middle Eastern power were long gone. At this point, Egypt had already been subjugated by the Assyrians before, but it was still a major conquest for the younger Achaemenid Empire because it had a large population and was still relatively wealthy. After Cambyses II began the golden age of the Persian Empire under Darius I, the third ruler of the empire, who stayed on the throne for 36 years. Darius kept expanding, but more importantly, he consolidated the largest state in the world by developing the administration, organizing provinces, and building a new capital, Persepolis. It is also under his reign that Greco-Persian Wars began. So let's take a look at all of this. As I told you, the Persians had been very influenced by the culture of the region where they settled around 1000 BC, by Elamite culture and then by Assyria. As subjects of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, they witnessed the rise and administration of one of the first multi-ethnic and multicultural empires in history. They learned a lot from it, and when the time arrived to organize their own empire under Cyrus the Great, they created an elaborate system to raise taxes or tributes, to travel around the empire, roads, to control different regions or mobilize armies. The empire was organized in provinces called satrapies. Each one was governed by a satrap, a kind of viceroy, who reported to the central government and was assisted by a general for the supervision of the army and a state secretary for the keeping of official records. These two aides also reported to the central government, which was a way of keeping control of each satrapy. At differing times there were between 20 and 30 satrapies. Ancient empires rarely kept a permanent army because it was too expensive. There were professional guards and a few soldiers, but in small numbers. Cyrus the Great created the base of a permanent army, a group of 10,000 highly trained soldiers, an elite called the Immortals. He also created a postal system from Egypt to India or to Central Asia. The journey could take months, but thanks to relay stations and riders, information could reach the main cities and the capital in just weeks or even days. When it came to culture and religion, the Achaemenids were noted by their contemporaries, especially the Greeks, for their policy of toleration. There were, for example, several official languages in use. Old Persian was one of them, but so was Elamite, Akkadian, the dialect of Babylon, and Aramaic, another language spoken in Mesopotamia. There were different writing systems in use, depending on the languages, but Mesopotamian languages and Old Persian had a cuneiform script. What is it? Cuneiform was a type of script that appeared in the Bronze Era, several thousand years ago, initially developed to write the Sumerian language of southern Mesopotamia. It is named cuneiform for the characteristic wedge-shaped impressions from Latin cuneus for wedge. Along with Egyptian hieroglyphs, it is one of the earliest writing systems, and the signs are not letters, they are a mix of symbols that represent a word and others that represent syllables. Cuneiform writing coexisted in the Near East with the Greek and the Roman alphabets, or Egyptian hieroglyphs, until the 1st century BC, and it disappeared when the languages that used it went extinct or when people stopped writing them. In the following centuries it was replaced by alphabetical systems, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and the knowledge of these ancient written languages disappeared until the 19th century, when they were deciphered again, at least some of them, because ancient Near East civilizations that used this system left hundreds of thousands of tablets. There is 500,000 of them in museums across the world. And a lot of what we know about ancient Mesopotamia, including Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, the Elamites, comes from the decipherment of these tablets that could be official documents or letters or all sorts of records. The Greek language was also in use. I'm going to tell you about Greco-Persian Wars in a moment, but we shouldn't see the relationship between the Persian Empire and the Greek world as two entirely separate worlds entering in conflict. Cyrus and his successors annexed various Greek-speaking regions in Anatolia or around the Black Sea, and there was a Greek minority within the frontiers of the empire. Greek was one of the languages used in Persia, among many others, and there were even Greeks working in the administration or in the building of palaces and cities long before the conquests of Alexander the Great. The most famous of these ancient Persian cities is probably Persepolis, a new capital built under Darius I, and we're going to take a look at it because it exemplifies the Achaemenid style of architecture and the wealth and power they had acquired. As I told you at the beginning, Persepolis is a Greek name. The ancient Persians called it Parsa. The site of Persepolis was chosen to create a brand new capital that would become the official and ceremonial center of the empire. But because the site was remote, in a mountainous region, it was not the most convenient residence for rulers of the empire, and they spent more time out of it in other residences like Susa. There was never a large population in Persepolis, so in that sense it is more a monument or a ceremonial complex than a city. It seems it was occupied seasonally, maybe to celebrate the Persian New Year, held at the spring equinox, and this was also the place where the nobility and representatives from provinces, from the satrapies, that paid tribute gathered to present gifts to the king. buildings at Persepolis included three different groups. There were military quarters, a treasury, and reception halls and occasional houses for the king. All of this stood on a large artificial terrace, and because the city was built to showcase the power of the kings, the architecture was spectacular and imposing. Achaemenid architecture was a reflection of this empire. It was eclectic and borrowed elements from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, to create a distinctly Persian style. Among the ruins of Persepolis, because the city was destroyed during the Greek invasion in 330 BC, less than 200 years after its founding, an element that stands out is the Gate of All Nations. It is a spectacular structure, the remain of a large room whose roof was supported by stone columns, and the entrances symbolically watched by massive statues of animals. There were two bulls to the west and two lamassu to the east. The lamassu were Mesopotamian protective deities, hybrids of a bull or a lion with wings and a human head. At the time when Persepolis was built, Persian kings had adopted a new state religion that became strongly associated with ancient Persia, Zoroastrianism. It is named after its spiritual leader or prophet, Zoroaster, who lived in the first millennium BC, and it entered recorded history in the 5th century BC, when it became a state religion. As far as we know, there were never any persecutions or attempts to impose this religion by the Achaemenids, but it gave it a status in what was now the largest empire in the world. By the 5th century BC, it is estimated that the empire had a population of almost 50 million, out of a world population of maybe 120 million. That is to say, if these estimates are true, about 40% of humanity. In terms of land controlled, it was much less than that, but the Persian Empire had very populated regions like Egypt or Mesopotamia that concentrated a large part of the world's population at the time. Zoroastrianism, which is also called Mastayasna sometimes, centers on the belief in a benevolent supreme being, a Hara Mazda. It contains an elaborate cosmology, a tale from the creation of the world to its upcoming end, and it enjoins its followers to reject evil, save their soul, and follow a number of rituals. These include the worship of fire, seen as a purifying force, or burial rituals. In the Persian tradition, the dead were not immediately buried, but they were placed inside a structure or on top of it, a sort of tower called Tower of Silence, where dead bodies were exposed to carrion birds like vultures. But Zoroastrianism had and still has many different aspects. It is little known nowadays, but it hasn't disappeared. Persian rulers kept it as the state religion for more than 1,000 years, until the Muslim conquest of Persia. After the conquest, A small minority continued to exist in Iran, but the majority converted or emigrated. Today there are Zoroastrian minorities in India and Pakistan, also in North America, but this faith only has something between 100 and 200,000 followers in the world. Still, it hasn't disappeared, and it is one of the oldest continuously practiced religions in the world. At the beginning of the 5th century, still during the reign of Darius, the Persian Empire entered in a conflict with Greece. The Persians had already conquered land north of Greece, the province of Thrace. But then there had been a revolt on the Aegean coast of Anatolia, where the ancient kingdom of Lydia was before its conquest by Cyrus. This was right in front of Greece on the other side of the Aegean Sea. And some Greek cities like Athens had supported the rebellion. This began a long period of war, during which Greek cities fought for their survival against an empire that was much bigger and powerful than they were. But against the odds, the Greeks resisted and almost prevailed. In 492 BC, a Persian expedition resubjugated Thrace and forced the kingdom of Macedonia to become a vassal, the same Macedonia that would produce Alexander the Great several generations later. But 2 years after that, in 490 BC, Persian forces were defeated by the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon, a major battle of the antiquity. The forces on each side are not known precisely, but the Persian army was far bigger than that of Athens. But the Greeks could choose a good site for the battle. There were marshes and mountains that prevented the Persian cavalry from joining the infantry, and with brilliant maneuvers they were able to envelop the Persians and rout them, causing the army to break in panic towards their ships. This victory gave Greece a long respite, because as Darius was preparing his revenge with a new invading force, his province of Egypt revolted, and he had to postpone a new Greek expedition. 10 years passed, and it is the son and successor of Darius, Xerxes I, who tried to complete the job, with an even bigger army than his father's. He organized a massive invasion by the north. In the first invasion, Athens was fighting almost alone, only with minor allies. But this time, many more Greek cities joined the war, especially Sparta, the other major power among Greek cities. In the first invasion, Sparta had not replied to a call for help from Athens, which was dishonorable and had remained as a stain on its reputation. This time, the Spartans threw all they could in the war, starting with a first battle that became legendary, the Battle of Thermopylae. It is the battle that inspired the 300 comic books and movies. Thermopylae was a Greek defeat, but a heroic one. The battlefield was a narrow coastal pass, and during the battle, the small force led by the king of Sparta, Leonidas, managed to block for 2 days the only road by which the massive Persian invasion force could pass, tens of thousands of men. but that was not enough to win. Estimates vary, but in average, modern historians believe that the Greek force amounted to around 7,000 men, when the Persians were 10 to 40 times more numerous. They suffered massive casualties, many more than the Greeks, but they could finally pass and keep advancing towards the south of Greece. The road to Athens was now open, and the city had been evacuated. Xerxes took it and sacked it, and at this point the situation looked desperate for the coalition of Greek cities. They faced the possibility of being overwhelmed and turned into a satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire. But victory changed side. A few months later, the Greeks won a decisive victory over the Persian fleet and forced Xerxes to retreat to the other side of the Aegean Sea in modern Turkey. The land army that he left behind was isolated, and the following year it was destroyed at the Battle of Plataea. This time the Greeks had had time to gather a much bigger force of around 80,000 men against a Persian army of about the same size or slightly bigger. At the time this was the largest Greek army ever assembled, and it prevailed, putting an end to this second Persian invasion. After that, the Persians lost their territories in Europe, and Macedonia retook its independence. Hostilities didn't cease between Greek cities and the empire in the following decades, and peace was finally signed only in 449 BC, 50 years after the beginning of these wars, leaving Persia slightly worse off than it was before. This was a setback, and indeed the best period of the Achaemenid Empire was now behind it. Expansion ceased. The resistance of Greece had been a problem, but more than anything, the empire was very big, and keeping it together required a lot of energy. This is a problem all empires in the antiquity faced when they became large. They were victims of their success. They had multiple enemies on their frontiers, and it took time to move armies. The provinces were different from one another, and succession crises often happened. Even the Roman Empire, several centuries later, which probably had the most efficient administration ever created at the time, reached a point when it could no longer grow and had to accept a stagnation. For a century more, until the rise of Alexander the Great, this is what happened to the Achaemenids. Their empire was still formidable, the largest and most populated state in the world by far, but they focused on keeping it united. And they were faced with revolts, especially a major Egyptian revolt in 404 BC. Egypt was lost for 60 years and was only reconquered in 343 BC. And then, suddenly, the empire collapsed like a house of cards when it was attacked by the greatest conqueror of the antiquity, Alexander the Great. The conquests of Alexander are another story that I told you about years ago. In only 3 years, from 334 to 331 BC, Alexander defeated repeatedly the larger armies of King Darius III and conquered the entire empire. But Alexander's empire didn't last longer than its creator. At Alexander's death, it broke up with different states, governed by his generals and followers. One of his generals tried to take control over the bulk of Alexander's legacy in Asia, Iran, Mesopotamia, and later Syria and Anatolia. But this empire, the Seleucid Empire, began to decline after its founder's death and was expelled from Iran by a new force that would dominate ancient Persia for centuries and to an extent replace the Achaemenids, the Parthians. You remember when we talked about ancient Iranian peoples who had occupied the Iranian Plateau, I told you about the Medes that repelled Syria and for a short time created the first Iranian Empire. It was quickly taken over by the Achaemenids, who were Persians. There was a third major group that had its heartland in the east of Iran, north of the Persians and east of the Medes, the Parthians. They had been integrated into the Achaemenid Empire, and they had become a province of the new Seleucid Empire. The province of Parthia revolted against its Greek masters, but during this rebellion, another Iranian tribe arrived from the south of the Caspian Sea, led by its king Xerxes, and they invaded Parthia. From this base, Xerxes established a new independent dynasty on the Iranian plateau, a small kingdom that managed to remain independent for a century. And then, suddenly, by the middle of the 2nd century BC, like Cyrus the Great had done for the early Achaemenid Empire, a successor of Xerxes turned the small kingdom into a great power by taking Media and Mesopotamia from the Seleucid. A new Iranian empire was born, the Parthian Empire, that lasted until the 3rd century AD and managed to recreate a large state centered on Iran that stretched at its height from eastern Turkey in the west to Afghanistan in the east. Like the Achaemenids, the Parthian Empire was culturally heterogeneous and made a synthesis of Greek, Persian, and various local regional cultures. The Parthians never could recreate the wealth and expansion of the Achaemenid Empire, but they lasted longer and became the new incarnation of Persia. In the west of their empire, they clashed with Rome. Until the 3rd century, the state of war with Rome never completely ended, and the Parthians effectively blocked Roman expansion in the Middle East. They competed with Rome to control Armenia to the north, and there were numerous battles. One of the most notable during the late Roman Republic, when Rome had adopted for its government the triumvirate system. Power had been shared between 3 men, including Julius Caesar and his ex-mentor Crassus. Each of them tried to gain military glory by conquering land for Rome. And Crassus launched an expedition against the Parthians. He was soundly defeated in 53 BC, and in the following years, much of the Levant fell to the Parthians. Due to its geography, the Parthian Empire also benefited from the Silk Road, the land route that connected China to the Mediterranean Sea, and trade was a resource that helped maintain the empire. but in the end of the 1st century, the Romans could annex the Levant and the front lines moved to Mesopotamia. Wars between the Romans and the Parthians were most of the time inconclusive because of very different military tactics. The Romans relied a lot on heavy infantry, which was powerful in pitched battles, but also very slow. The Parthians, on the other hand, had mainly cavalry, either heavy riders in armor or mounted archers, and this meant that they were very hard to defeat for the Romans because they were much faster and could harass or refuse to fight. But on the other hand, the Parthians had very little skill in siege warfare, so they would not really occupy conquered areas, and because of these weaknesses on both sides, neither the Romans nor the Parthians were able to annex each other's territory, and the status quo often prevailed. Rather than a foreign power, it is internal instability that put an end to the Parthian Empire. In 224 AD, in the 3rd century, the last king was defeated by one of his vassal peoples, the Persians, under yet a new dynasty, the Sassanians. The Sasanian or Sassanid Empire is also called Neo-Persian Empire by historians, and it was the longest lasting of all of them. The same dynasty stayed in power for over 4 centuries, until the 7th century AD, and it replaced the Parthian Empire, but expanded it further, and almost reached the same size as the Achaemenid Empire when it was at its height. The Iranians became a superpower of the antiquity again during this period, and actually it is generally called the Sasanian Empire by historians after the dynasty, but it called itself Empire of Iranians. It carried on the legacy of its predecessors on many aspects. The state religion remained Zoroastrianism. It dealt with a variety of cultures, religions, and languages. The Persian language had evolved to a new form called Middle Persian, which is the linguistic ancestor to modern Persian. The writing system for the language had left behind cuneiform to replace it with an alphabet, or actually several different alphabets. And the cultural influence of the Sassanians cannot be underestimated. Apart from Iran, the empire maintained a presence for centuries in what is now Afghanistan, the south of Central Asia, Pakistan, Iraq, and there were trade and cultural influences with China, India, Byzantium, the Arabian Peninsula. Actually, when the Muslim Conquest started from Arabia in the 7th century and effectively destroyed the Sasanian Empire, it also embraced a lot of its culture. The Persian Empire formed the basis for much of early Islamic culture, be it architecture, the arts, music, literature, even philosophy. And the absorption of the Neo-Persian Empire is one of the mechanisms through which the Muslim world quickly took in a large intellectual legacy from the antiquity. This empire also had a tumultuous history, with favorable periods when it was politically stable and in expansion, like in the 4th and the 6th centuries, separated by intermediate periods of difficulties and setbacks. But what characterizes its political situation the most is a constant state of war with Rome and then Byzantium, continuing the rivalry that the Parthians already had with this powerful neighbor. These Roman Persian Wars that began in the 1st century BC and ended in the 7th century AD, that is to say almost 700 years, these are the longest lasting conflicts in human history, and they ended without a victor. The fighting was not constant, it was more a series of wars, and it culminated in the Byzantine Sasanian War from 602 to 628 AD, during which the Sassanians laid siege to Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, but without success. I will also put the link to the story about the history of Byzantium in the description for you. In this war, the Sassanians were successful for the first 20 years. They took much of the Levant, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia from Byzantium, and this is the time when they reached their maximal expansion. But the war turned into a disaster in the last years. After the failure in front of Constantinople, they were forced onto the defensive against Emperor Heraclius, who campaigned in the heartland of Persia. A civil war broke out, the Persian king was killed, and they had to sue for a peace that brought back the two empires to the pre-war status quo. But the war had also exhausted the belligerents, politically and militarily. So when the Arab invasion began, a few years later, this was at the worst possible moment for both. And this is one of the reasons why the Muslim conquest was so quick and could take much of Byzantium and all of Persia in such a short time. By the middle of the 7th century, the Sasanian Empire was gone. Iran was officially converted to Islam. Judaism, Christianism, or Zoroastrianism maintained a presence that declined but was never entirely suppressed, including to our days. But the dominant religion became Islam, and after an early schism, Shia Islam. With an already long history and a vast cultural area, Persia didn't disappear with the end of its last antique empire. Quite the opposite, actually. It continued to be a cultural and intellectual center inside the Muslim world, and its very eventful history continued with periods of invasions and rebirth during the Middle Ages and modern times. But this was the end of the antiquity for Persia, and the end of our story for tonight. I hope you liked it, and I'll talk to you soon with a new topic. In the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams.